Making sushi in real life demands taste and skill. Now, I have a taste for sushi, but I don't know that I have the skill to actually pull off making it. But I am confident that you and I can make sushi in 3D using Blender, and that's what we are going to do today. Now, I'm not going to hold your hand and walk you through every step of the process of making this particular sushi, but what I do want to show you is how to use a simple geometry node setup to make the rice. I'll also cue you in on how I made the seaweed wrapper and the sauce that goes on top. Let's dive right into it. I am using 3 Division's default cube as my startup file for Blender. Now, this cube comes with several starter materials that can be adapted for any project, and it also comes preloaded with the Blender's Hotkey Cheat Sheet that we made here at 3 Division, and that gives you access to it easily if you're just getting started in Blender. Now, if you want to get your hands on this free blend file, just follow the link in the description. For now, I'm going to disable this collection, and we are going to begin by adding a cylinder. So hit Mesh and then Cylinder, Shift A, Mesh, Cylinder, because this is the basic shape of our piece of sushi. Now, I'm going to just scale this down. I know it's not going to be exactly correct in terms of measurements, but I know that a piece of sushi is not 2 meters wide. So we're just going to scale it down to eyeball it. If we want to be precise, we can hit the N key to pull up this information menu, go to item and see exactly how big this is. So right now we are at about 10 centimeters. Let's go down to 0.05. And even though that might be a little big, it's going to work for the rendering that we're going to do here in just a minute. So now that we've got the size of it generally positioned, I'm going to scale the Z axis by hitting S and then Z, and let's just make it something that looks about the size of a piece of sushi. Now, we're going to be able to come back and edit this at any point, but this is going to be the start of our rice. And in order to keep going with our rice, we are going to add geometry nodes. So a couple of things I want to do to make sure this mesh is ready to go before we add the geometry node setup. I'm going to go to my front view. I'm going to hit G, Z, and just move it up to set the bottom of the piece of sushi right on the x-axis there. And then I'm going to hit Control and A while I have this selected so that my scale is applied and that scale changes that we've made here to this mesh do not get applied to every other parameter that we change down the road. With that being said and everything being ready, let's go ahead and switch over to the default geometry nodes panel here in Blender. I'm going to collapse this panel down just by clicking and dragging there. And then now we have the ability to create our geometry node setup. So let's zoom in on our piece of sushi. And for the sake of order, I'm going to call this sushi. Actually, let's call it rice because that's what we're actually creating here, rice. And let's begin by creating a new geometry node setup with this button right here. If you're new to geometry nodes, then you need to know that it gets applied as a modifier over here in the modifier stack. Now you have, if I pull this out a little bit, you can have the name of the geometry node itself. This is just simply the name of the modifier in the stack. And then this name right here matches the one over here that is essentially the exact geometry node setup. So we're going to call this one rice. And then you'll see that it's also changed over here in our little drop down at the top of the geometry nodes window. Now with the geometry nodes, we have the group input and the group output. This means geometry in and geometry out. If I cut this and I have Node Wrangler enabled, so I can hit Control and right click and just knife across it. If I disconnect that, then you'll see that the geometry has disappeared entirely. And what I can do is actually add my own geometry. So I could add mesh and then go down here to primitives and select something like a cube. And then if I plug this cube into the geometry, oh, I missed, then we've got a cube back in our scene. And then I can change, right now this is 1 by 1 by 1. I can change the point 2 by 2 by 2 and so on. Now here's how we're going to use it in this scene. I first of all need some rice. So before I even do anything here, I'm actually going to create my particular rice granules. And I'm going to do this manually because I just personally find it easier to do it manually than to generate it here in the geometry node setup. So let's actually go back to layout. I'm going to hit Shift and A and we're going to get ourselves a, let's let's do a cube. And then I'm just going to scale this down. Now it's a piece of rice, so it needs to be small. Let's actually bring I'm going to bring my rice back into the scene, go to the geometry nodes, reconnect them so that we can see it here in proportion to our cube. And then I want to scale this down, and essentially we're going to make what is going to be a cube of rice. So let's add a subdivision surface modifier to that cube. I'm going to scale this along let's scale it along the X. SX. Okay, there we go. I'm going to tab. Let's add another cut in there so that now we've got this kind of rice granule. I'm going to shade it smooth, and let's actually make these outer ends just a little bit smaller. So I'm going to grab these outside edges and just scale them down. Shift and X. I don't want them to be scaled on the X. And then just scale it down a little bit. Now we've got a rice granule. I could even bump this up to 2 so that it's a little more rounded, and then turn off optimal display so that I can make sure I can see what the geometry looks like. Now this is going to get pretty dense because we're going to add a bunch of these rice kernels in our sushi, so we don't want it actually that dense. So let's go there. I'm going to scale it along the X just a little bit. There we go. Okay, this looks like a decent grain of rice. Now let's actually duplicate this. I'm going to move it over here, and let's make this one white, a little flatter and a little wider or longer. I mean, we're just going to adjust the size a little bit of this thing. And what we're looking to do here, something important to know, we're going to multiply this hundreds of times over. And we can add an additional scale parameter to randomize the scale. What we want to be trying to do here, though, is changing the shape of the rice kernel, because the shape of the rice kernel is something that we're not going to be changing with the scale. So we're trying to create different rice kernel shapes. Now I'm going to move this one, and we're going to make this one just kind of like almost round. There we go. That looks pretty good. So we've got 3 different shapes of rice kernel now. I'm going to rename this kernel 1. We'll name this one kernel 2. Kernel 2. And we'll name this one kernel 3. Now, here's what I usually do when I am making something like this that I'm going to be duplicating everywhere. The material gets set in the geometry nodes here in just a minute. So what you need to do is actually create a material and apply it to each one of these so that we can change that material later. So I'm going to create a new material. I'm going to call this rice, and let's make it, for now, I'm going to make it like a orange color there. And then we're going to switch to rice and switch over here, add the rice. Okay, so now if we switch to material preview, you can see we have our rice color showing up. Now, of course, that's not the color of rice, and it's not the color we're going to use, but it just makes it clear here in just a little bit, and we can adjust it as needed. Now, let's go back to our rice here. Actually, one more step before we do. These need to all be reset back at position 0, so I'm going to hit Option G. With all of them selected, I'm going to hit Control A, apply the scale, and we're good to go. Now, let's move those into a rice collection. I'm going to call this one rice. And now we have a rice collection with the different kernels, and we are set to go for our geometry nodes. I'm going to actually disable this rice collection so that we can't see it. So let's add a mesh to volume node. I'm going to hit Shift and A while my cursor is down here in the geometry nodes window, and I'm going to search for mesh to volume, and there it is. Let's just go ahead and plug it in here on the line, on that little noodle, and now you can see we still have the mesh there, but it's actually just a volume. Now, because there's no material on it, it's turned invisible. Let's now add a distribute node, distribute points on faces. That's if you're wanting to put something on the surface face, but we want to distribute points in a volume. Now I'm going to drop that there on the noodle, and what we'll begin to see is nothing, because these points don't show up anywhere in the scene. Now, what we can do, though, is now that we've got these points existing in that volume, we can take this points and do instances on points. Now, what's happening is we're taking the group geometry input from one side, plugging it into these operations, and changing the final output. So let's plug that into the geometry. So let's add a mesh. I'm going to add mesh primitives. Let's do cube. I'm going to take this cube, let's make it really small, 0.01. We are going to add a cube to this instance socket. So what this does is we've got the mesh to the volume, we're distributing points in the volume, then we're on those points, we are adding this mesh. Now, the reason we're not seeing anything yet is because the density is super low. So both the density of the mesh volume and the density of the points in the volume. So let's bump this up from something like 1 to something like 2,000. Now, that still hasn't done much, but the density of the mesh is enough that we can start distributing points in that mesh. Let's bump this one up to something like 1,000. And now you can see we are distributing those individual cubes all throughout the space of that mesh. Now I'm going to bump that up even further until we get even more dense of a volume and start seeing the shape a little bit better. Okay, so now you can see that initial shape that we had of a cylinder is starting to get filled with the individual cubes here. Now I'm going to even bump this up to something like 5,000. That's looking better. And then let's actually bump this one up to something like 10,000. And then I'll bump this one down to the 5,000 just for now. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Now what we want to do is, instead of distributing this cube throughout the mesh, we want to actually distribute our rice. To do that, I'm going to delete this cube first. I'm going to click and drag this rice collection down here into my geometry node setup. Now you can see it says collection info, we have the rice, and then we have this instances socket on the right hand side, which means we can plug that instance into our instance up here. And now our rice is being duplicated throughout that volume. However, we have a couple problems. One, every one of those pieces of rice is being put on that point. So all three of them are being placed at every position. So I'm going to hit separate children, and then I'm going to do pick instance. And what that's going to do is pick one of the instances from that collection to put on a given point, which means we don't get this problem of the entire collection being duplicated on every point. Now, here's another problem. Everything is rotated in the exact same way, and everything is too large. So let's bump the scale down to something like 0.1. Well, now we've got rice, but the kernels are pretty tiny. Maybe like that's too big, I think. 0.3 maybe, 0.2. 0.2 looks pretty good. Now let's get some random rotation in here. In order to do that, I'm going to hit Shift A. I'm going to search for random, and we get a random value node. I'm going to take this value node and plug it here into the rotation, and now that gives us randomized rotation for each one of these objects. Now I'm going to even bump that up just a little more so that the random rotation appears a little bit more random. And then we're going to start playing with the density again. Now we have this 10,000 and we have 5,000 here. I'm actually going to make this 20, and that's pretty good. And we're going to bump this one up to 10. Oh, not 1,000, 10,000. And there we go. Now we've got something beginning to approximate a rice ball. Now the scale, I think we could probably go up a little bit and start packing that out a little more. Yeah, that's not too bad. All right, so things are looking pretty good with our rice. The only problem that we have really is that we don't have enough. We need to add more. In order that we won't have to use such massive numbers, what we're going to do is grab a math node. I'm going to search for math, and you don't want the vector math, you just want a standard math. I'm going to change this to multiply. We're going to plug in a value from the group input. Now watch what happens to our geometry nodes modifier when we do that. When I plug this in here, we actually get a value showing up over here in this window. I can change the default value here by going to my node wrangler setup. If you hit N on the keyboard, you'll get this little menu, and you've got these group sockets, and this one just says value. We can call this one rice density, and then you can see that the name has been changed over here, and then we can change the default value down here from 0.5 to something like 1,000. Let's start it at 10 actually. Who knows what we're going to run into, so we don't want to start it too high. So we've got a rice density. If I hit backspace now, while I'm hovering over that, it'll reset it to the default value, and the default is 10. Then I hit N while my mouse is hovering here in the geometry nodes panel to get rid of that. And then I've got this multiply node here. Now what I'm going to do is take my 10, and we're going to take that times, let's do 1,000. Okay, so we've got a value of 1,000 in there. I'm going to take that value now and plug that into the density, and that density there. So both densities are affected by the exact same value over here. So we've got a rice value density of 10 times 10,000 times 1,000, which means we have 10,000 as our density for both the mesh to volume and the distribute points in mesh, which means that I can very easily change this to 50, and now we get a much denser result, and this is looking much more like rice in a piece of sushi. So now let's begin thinking about how we are going to handle the rest of the project. So we have to create a mesh that is going to be the wrap around the outside, and we have to create space on the inside for the fish and the avocado. Now, I'm not going to walk you through every exact step of how I'm going to get where I'm going, but I do want to introduce you to the concept. So let's hit Shift A, and I'm going to add a cube, and then we're going to scale this cube down small enough to kind of use as a Boolean, as a cutter, to cut out the center of this rice. Now, once I've got that Boolean in there, I'm going to hit Control A to apply the scale. Shift select the rice, and since I have the bool tool enabled in my add-ons, I can hit Control and the number pad minus, and that will create a Boolean out of this mesh. Now you can see that nothing has happened, and this is for a couple of reasons. One, we haven't actually taken this geometry node setup and realized it, so it's not real geometry yet. These are just instances of those rice pieces that have been added to the volume. That's one reason. The second is because of the order of things now in this geometry stack. So if we had realized those instances, then Blender would probably be crashing right now because it's trying to create a Boolean through thousands of pieces of rice, individual meshes. But if what we do is take this Boolean cube and pop it up on top of that geometry nodes, then the Boolean operation is happening before the geometry to volume, which means that the volume shape is being affected by the original mesh shape. So now what I can do is I can scale and size that however I want, and that's going to change the size and scale of our rice. Now at this point, I think it would be appropriate for us to go ahead and change the color on our rice material to something a little more like rice so that we're not dealing with all of these problems. Now I'm going to adjust the subsurface to 1. I'm going to change it to Christensen Burley, which is a way of faking subdivision surface, and you have to do that if you're using Eevee, which I am. And so I'm going to switch it there, and now we've got kind of a more natural look to our rice. Now, of course, as we're looking at it here, you can see I've enabled the rice. I need to disable that. I'm going to select this though and go back to my geometry nodes and begin taking a look at what we are dealing with here. Now, the density needs to be a lot thicker. So let's select that. And you can see that when you select it right now, it's not popping up down below, and you might wonder where all of your nodes have gone. If you select that object and then you click on this little button here at the left of the geometry node, then all of your geometry nodes set up for this particular mesh will come back. I'm going to turn off the visibility of the overlays here on the viewport so I can see the density and make sure that everything is working fine. Let's bump it back up to 50. We don't want to be able to see through this sea of rice. We want it to be pretty compact. And I think we can even now bump up the scale just a little bit. So let's do 0.25 and see how that looks. Yeah, that looks pretty good. It almost looks like it's still too small though, proportionately to the size of sushi. And this is something that you can come in and adjust on your own as you play with it. Let's back off the density to something like 40 now. I think we still need that 50 density, but we can probably pull 0.35. Let's see. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. Now, you can take a look at references and get a sense for exactly how big the whole thing needs to be. I'll leave that up to you. Now, let's approach the Shrinkwrap modifier. I'm going to go to my layout, and I'm going to create that seaweed that's going to surround it. So let's go to Mesh. I'm going to add a cylinder. Now, let's scale this down until we get to about the size. I'm going to switch to solid mode till we get to just outside the size of that piece of sushi. And I'm going to go into edit mode with my tab key. I'm going to select these two faces, hit X and delete faces. And then let's begin to size this thing up. SC, GZ. All right, we want to wrap this piece of sushi in this seaweed. So I'm going to scale it till it's just kind of outside of my rice mesh. And then we're going to take this and I'm going to shade smooth. I'm going to add a few extra cuts in here so that we've got just a little bit more geometry to work with. And then I'm going to tab back out of edit mode. Now, let's add a Shrinkwrap modifier to this. So add, generate, or deform rather, and then Shrinkwrap. Now it needs to know what mesh it's going to wrap itself onto. And so you need to use this eyedropper, and you can select our object rice. Now you can see that nothing has happened. And that's because of what I mentioned earlier about the Boolean, that we haven't actually realized these instances. So let's go back to our geometry nodes. I'm going to change to solid view again. Let's select our rice. And then on this end, after our instances, what we want to do is grab what's called a realize instances node. I'm going to drop that on this noodle between the instances and the geometry output. And now you can see our Shrinkwrap modifier is actually taking effect. And this is because there is now real geometry for the Shrinkwrap to attach itself to. Now let's go back over here to our Shrinkwrap modifier, and we can make sure that we have the best settings possible. You can set outside, inside, you can change the method of the Shrinkwrap to try to get some better results. You can grab your mesh and move it up or down. Now, right now you can see that there's a lot of pieces of rice that are sticking out of the outside. Now, in order to fix that, what you might end up doing is just going here to the offset and 0.001 maybe. Oh, it needs to be minus 0.001. And just kind of pop it out a little bit. That could help. Maybe even more, 0.5. And then now that you've got a little bit of an offset, let's go ahead and add generate solidify, because obviously this thing isn't just flat. So we're going to solidify it with a thickness of 0.001 for now. Let's see how that looks. Control A scale. That's right, my scale wasn't applied, so this thickness is going to be off just a little bit, 0.005. And then let's go back to rendered mode. Now you can see that we've got some of that subdivision surface fake happening down there with the red, and you might want to change that color. But what I'm going to do now is add a material to this. Let's make it green, let's make it dark, and let's bring the saturation down pretty low. Okay, so now we've got our seaweed, and let's just kind of scale it down a little bit maybe. I'm going to grab it and move it down a touch. And then you can just play with that solidify modifier to increase the thickness. Oh, I went the wrong way with the thickness. That's why it's not looking good. Minus 0.001. Actually, if you want to make this proper, you could change the offset to a positive one. Change that to 0. I'm going to hit shift so that I can pull it in. 0.001. There we go. That looks pretty good. Maybe even less, 0.0005. And I added a 6 in there, but that's just fine. All right, so now we have a seaweed wrap here on the outside of this. Now what we can do is go a little bit further, add a subdivision surface modifier, and that'll clean things up just a touch, make the edges a little bit softer and smoother like it's been cut. So let me show you real quick what I did to create the Boolean for the fish in the middle. So let's create a quick fish object. I'm going to do a cube. Let's scale this down a little bit. Okay, there we go. Move it up. I'm going to scale it on the X. Let's tab, Control R. And let's just start making this piece of fish. Okay, so, and then let's say we have another one. Okay, so you can kind of see, like, this is my fish, let's say. I'm going to take these two, just kind of move them in, kind of like they're bunched in together. Let's grab this edge here and slide it. Just kind of make the whole thing pretty compact, like we compacted this piece of fish together. Now what I did is I joined these two together. I joined my two pieces of fish and avocado together. And then what I did, like, let's position them. I'm going to pull them down here. Let's say they're here in the middle. And let's go ahead and give them a material just so that we can see what this kind of looks like. So let's go to rendered mode. Now you can see we've got our fish here in the middle of our sushi. So what I did from here is I duplicated my fish. So let's call this one fish 2, and we'll call this other one fish 1. I disabled fish 1 for now, and then I tabbed into my edit mode. And if you go to A, go to mesh, and then there's this option up here for convex hull. And if you hit that, it will enclose the existing vertices in a shape that is a singular shape, but that encases all existing vertices. So let me show you what that means if I unhide the rest of this. Now we have one mesh that kind of surrounds every point that we had in our existing pieces of mesh. Now what this allows me to do is use that as my Boolean. So now my fish tool, I'm going to call it fish2 bool, And then I'm going to scale it up just a little bit. Okay, let's just scale without doing it just on the Z. So let's now select our rice, and you'll see that we still have a Boolean modifier over here, but since we deleted that previous cube, there's actually no object existing here. So I'm going to actually just delete this entire modifier with this X key. And then I'm going to disable the geometry nodes, because if we have them in the improper order in the stack, then trying to make the Boolean through all the rice is going to slow the computer down significantly. So what I want to do first is select this, select my mesh, Control minus on the number pad. And now you can see that we have a hole cut out of our rice that just about fits our fish. Now you can see it's not perfect. There's some changes that we're going to have to make to it to make it work. But we can go ahead and select that Boolean operation, that Boolean object. And I'm just going to add a real quick loop cut there and just grab this and move it in and tab out of edit mode. And now you can see that it's hugging things a lot better. I like that. And I think that's going to work for our purposes. So let's just see if it does. I'm going to switch back to my rendered mode. And then I'm going to go to my rice mesh. Let's drag the Boolean on top of the geometry nodes and then re-enable the geometry nodes to see how this works. And you can see that the geometry is actually hugging my fish quite nicely. So it looks like the fish is enclosed and kind of encased in this rice. So from here, all you have to do is select what kind of fish and veggies you want in your sushi, put it in the middle, and you are good to go. Another cool aspect of the sushi is that I have this sauce sitting on top of it, and I want to show you real quick how I did that. The sauce started with a curve, so I'm going to add an Bezier curve up here at the top. I'm going to go to my overhead view and just scale this baby down until it's small enough to fit on top of this sushi. Now, if you tab into edit mode, with a Bezier curve, you have these individual points and then you have handles that accompany them. I'm going to grab this piece and just move it up here, grab this one, move it down here, rotate it. I'm going to select the whole thing, right click, subdivide, and then that gives us one more point that we can grab and use a handle on. And you can add points, you can extrude them and move them and add them however you need in order to get the kind of sauce spread that you want there on your sushi. If you scale those handles down, the effect of the handle is reduced dramatically and you're able to have a little bit more control over where things go. So let's say we're actually doing something more like a spiral of sauce on this particular piece of sushi. Now, what I did when I finished this is I right click and I'm going to convert this to a mesh. Now, if I tab into edit mode, you'll see that I have individual vertices here ready to go. This is perfect for the next step. Add a modifier, hit generate skin, and the whole thing is huge, way too big. So in order to change it though, here's how you actually adjust it. You tab into edit mode and you can't really see what you're doing unless you switch to wireframe. If you hit Control A, you'll see that a scale type operation happens. And so imagine Control A is just the new scale for the skin modifier. Control A, you can scale it in, and now you can go to solid mode, and here we go. This is looking pretty good. I'm going to drop this down here, kind of on top of my sushi. And then what I'm going to do is add a subdivision surface modifier. Now, if I change this to 2, and then I'm going to shade it smooth, hang on, I've got to add smooth shading over here as a smooth by angle. There we go. And then let's ignore sharpness and let's make this 180 degrees. And now we have a smooth shaded object. And the reason that we have to do it over here is because the modifiers adjust the shading as they are stacked. So the smooth shading option here is applied before the modifiers, and you have to use the smooth by angle to make it happen if you've got modifiers on the stack. So with that being explained, now what I did was I just went and grabbed individual points, hit Control A, and just kind of began to imagine the places where it would be a little bit fatter. And so then of course I adjust these ends in order to make them look right. And then you can just kind of decide what happened with the sauce. Like where were they really heavy on the sauce? Where was it light? Maybe they got too much there. Yeah, and you can just make it look as fat or as lean as you would like. And then we've got our nice little drizzle of sauce on top. The other thing I did in order to add a little bit more finesse to this was I added a displace modifier. So if you go to generate and then I go to, deform, and then displace. Now, of course, it's gone crazy again, and that's because it needs a texture. I had new texture, and that doesn't seem to do much. Let's call this one sauce. And then I'm going to go down to this texture panel. You can see I'm adjusting sauce. I want to change this to clouds. And then now it's gone really wonky. Let's change the size up to something pretty big. I think that should, let's just go all the way up to 2. And let's change the depth maybe down a little bit. Make it even more wobbly. Like you want it to be less pronounced, less clear up here. And then let's go back into the modifier stack. And I'm just going to pull the strength of this effect down to be something really low. And you can see, there we go, as we pop it up just a little bit, it gives just a little bit of warble to the whole thing. And I'm actually going to go back down to my texture now that I've got the effect dialed back. And we're going to see what happens when I change the size and shape of it. And there you can kind of see it's adding, let's go back up to 1. We might need a little more depth there. It's just adding a little something to make it look a little bit more organic. And that's how I added my sauce to the top. And then what I did simply was I ended up going back in and applying the skin modifier so that I could flatten the bottom part of the mesh and make it look like it was sitting on the rice more than, you know, kind of just occluding it. So that was what I did, and that is how we had our sauce. And of course I added some kind of mustardy type color and then changed the roughness down so that it would be nice and shiny, and then you've got a nice little sauce on top of your sushi. I hope this has been helpful to you, giving you some ideas for how you can create your own sushi, and not only sushi but create all sorts of other objects in 3D. And there you have it. With just a few clicks, you and I are now digital sushi chefs. We would love to see what you have created, and you can share it over on our Discord server. Just use the link that's in the description below. If you enjoyed learning from us and you'd like to come back for more, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell here on YouTube so that you know the next time that one of our tutorials drops. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.